Hello everyone, today we talk about Northern Gallic cavalry for our series about Celtic warfare, the enemies of Rome, etc. I am mildly satisfied, which is rare, right, and an accomplishment, about my recent Celtic warfare content output. It's never enough, obviously, but in the last months I randomly got these topics, and I was glad to thicken the ranks of such theme. And you know that, unfortunately, we do not really have an enormous amount of evidence about the Celts. About most of these populations, we have only very vague hints, right? When we hear for Northern Gallic cavalry, of course, the only actual source aside from archaeology, which follows pretty sort of standard pattern at the end of the day, at least for the broader Gallic dimension, and even beyond, is Caesar, right? That, contrarily to all the sort of anti-Romanistic superstitions and mental illnesses, provides us with an actually positive picture about the Celtic military capacities, at least. This swings depending on, of course, there is always a matter of, Roman quality put on the fore, which, however, cannot be denied if you consider that Gaul was conquered in only 8 years and remained under the Romans for good. So when I make these videos, believe me, I love the Celts and the Gauls in particular. Since I was a kid, I can't make videos about my sort of historical nostalgia, right, from my childhood, etc. But one has always to be honest to the objective realization that the military average of these people was not particularly high. Today we fundamentally talk about Belgian cavalry, about which I browsed the Commentario del Bello Gallico a little bit to find some specific information on these people's cavalry that, however, remains relatively generic, right? Caesar presents us rightfully, also in a strategic sense, with a clear idea of how these armies fought. As of all, Caesar is a very, in fact, it sounds banal or idiotic to say, a very Roman mindset, meaning, however, something specific in here compared to, say, what we're habituated more often, that is the Hellenic sources and the Hellenic way of categorizing, of distinguishing, of rationalizing positivistically the account. The Romans cared about moral forces. They're much closer to the Clausewitzian theory. I also made a video about the Fortuna Kaiseris explaining exactly that from a theological point of view, not just an historical one. And so we have an idea more or less of how these, of course, specifically Northern Gallic cavalrymen fought, but unfortunately we do not have extra precise info, if not from archaeology. In fact, I will surely make other videos about Celtic cavalry, not just from this time, but also, for example, Southern Gallic cavalry. Was there a difference? Well, basically just one of custom and of moral force. When you look at the hardware, differences were not that dramatic. Actually, the Belgians that, according to the same Roman sources, framed themselves as sort of Celto-Germanic peoples because they deemed Gaul, properly the Gallic heartland, was sort of the more advanced, more gentrified. One hand, also more developed political bodies, etc., were considered, in fact, too weak, right? Sources in this sense are accurate because part of the reason why the Belgians, or the Helvetii, but specifically the Belgians, were actually the strongest Celtic peoples, right, in the broader, let's say, group of populations that we profile as the Celts, right, greatly dispersed, as you know, all across Europe, and not only, is in fact the contact with even more warlike peoples like the Germans, who were pushing down, and as you know, had triggered the same Roman intervention in Gaul. I have also talked about Germanic warfare at length on a Schwerpunkt, but again, especially for ancient times, we still have to get a bit into this. Made multiple videos about Celto-Germanic warfare, and we have highlighted how even in there, especially these frontier areas, it's difficult to even distinguish technically what is Celtic, what is Germanic. But this is not much the point in itself. The Belgians, this major group between, in fact, Germany and Central Gaul, were at large Celtic, right, culturally, and they were also the ones responsible for fundamentally the settlement in Britain, for which the Britons are technically and largely Belgians in many ways. I also made a video about the Celtic war chariot, this area, in a pretty generic sort of Iron Age context. And the Belgians definitely were the toughest nut to crack in Gaul for the Romans. Their military profile actually did not emphasize cavalry much, because they were, in a sense, a more primitive people. Caesar makes it clear, but in this sense it was also a more youthful one, a more robust one, where wealth was sort of more evenly distributed. And you know what this means compared to the sort of proto-feudal Gallic standard that existed to some degree also in northern Gaul. In here is that infantry, like freemen, had largely maintained their own prerogatives, at least to an extent that had reduced the capacity probably of the nobility to just field a larger amount of cavalry that in the ancient world was normally believed to be actually a cowardly arm to be fighting with, because the idea is that on horseback you could simply flee more easily from the battlefield. We've seen there are many episodes in ancient warfare. In the video about the Battle of Strasbourg, we've seen how the Germans taunted their own cavalry, and that was obliged to dismount because that was the aristocracy that was, and it happens, believe me, I've seen it in medieval history, medieval warfare many times. They would abandon the infantry to their fate on the battlefield, so that at home, right, the people could become weaker and the aristocracy rising further in power, right? So the idea is that the Belgians were more politically cohesive, which is what actually makes a higher military average in every context. So the fact that they were actually more primitive and backwards in some aspect, for example, the maintenance of chariot warfare, doesn't mean in this case, because of course politics is more important than technology, this is actually the point, stronger, of course, than the other goals. And they were banally also more distant from the Mediterranean, so Caesar has to arrive, he makes a bit of a tour of Gaul around. There are rebellions. The Belgians would also inflict to the Romans severe losses in ambushes. Of course, they were, militarily inferior to now the Roman military machine. It was really a well-oiled and built up one from centuries of practice, now a fully professional military, etc. So there is no game. If you want, it's not the Belgians alone that make the difference, also because in spite of their cohesion, they actually fragment during Caesar's times, and so this reflected, in spite of their, being the highest by Celtic standards, still they were politically weak to the point that they couldn't display their greater force. And you can't quite say, so the Romans were cheating. No, the Romans weren't, because the Romans were, of course, much more advanced, also in that political sense. And this people was in crisis, and the Romans took them down piecemeal. And this is a bit the history of the Gallic Wars, just per se. But there is a specific reason why these peoples were so politically fragmented and so dysfunctional in a military sense. That, as always, has to do with the level of collective training, right? Which is very different, of course, from an individual point of view. Most people that I've met, of course, being still at the level I am for the Romans or I am for the Gauls or whomever, do not grasp this. The difference between collective and individual training, right? The Belgians, look at the Battle of the Sabis River, is basically my favorite of the entire commentary, the Bello Gallico, is, except Alige, okay, but, that's just the evergreen, right? But, of course, the Belgians stand out in that context for being extremely tough single warriors, right? That attack the Romans on an impossible ground, suffering severe losses, just trying to and almost managing to smash the same Roman army. And yet, of course, we see the limits of this. And we have, especially in the Battle of the Sabis River, an idea also of how their cavalry worked, at least. They used a tactic that I think speaks for itself. That is to say, at some point they emerged during the encounter, and they remained. However, the Romans sent cavalry and infantry against them, and this Celtic cavalry basically begins to station around the forest and sort of entering it, coming out, launching these raids, and that is definitely not the behavior of a particularly confident cavalry that can meet in open ground. Aside from the fact, and here, of course, the Romans were in fact using combined arms, and this Gauls, at least as far as this cavalry was concerned, and that action wasn't, right? So that always is an indicator that speaks of how you can't really put these military systems on the same level. Again, individually, it's a wholly different story, right? It's the difference between a Caesar and a Vercingetorix, right? Caesar won in the way he did, and of course there was a narrow sort of, margin for that on multiple occasions, but the reason why that eventually was in Rome's favor was because of this higher civilizational standard. Whereas if, I don't know, Vercingetorix would have, fought with Caesar in single duel, this is not to say that actually the Roman nobility at this point did not have an impressive martial training, which is often overlooked. If you look at Caesar's military career, also in his youth, you will realize that. Well, but Caesar would have probably made the end of a ham or of some sort. In Belgica, so among these at large northern Gallic populations, then of course in the west there was Armorica, there were different populations, but approximating at least for today's video about the Belgians, as we just say, from a numerical point of view, a proportional point of view as well, there would have been less cavalry around, right? The central Gauls could mobilize more troops, could even equip them better, but as we've seen, they were also less trained overall, and many of those peoples would have been already demilitarized under their aristocracies to an extent, in fact, that they could make just mass in a way that the stereotype of the Celt was, of the Celtic tactics especially, was the idea of a single massive charge, or repeated ones, but just to exhaustion and not much other, tactical combination. Actually, this is not entirely true, but it's also not very distant from reality. The Germans were said, for example, even they were much more brutally and traumatically primitive, of course, for that reason also having maintained, at least in their case, because there were some very, backwards populations that had a ridiculous military outreach, but the Germans were many, they were compact, they were pushing the way through, and they were instead stereotypically pictured, also in the engagements, and mostly at that point, historiographically, against the Romans, as, for example, being able to withdraw in good order, pulling their wounded, back, sort of no man's left behind, etc. And of course, they were similar peoples. These are opinions based on some anecdotes and really the few information that we have overall. But of course, if you look at this complexively, you do understand that, of course, there is no conspiracy theory about what these peoples were. It's not about being classicistic in actually believing. These sources that are also the only ones that coherently explain the picture. After all, if they had been saying something strange, we would have noticed. And we know this from other peoples in military history, anthropologically and beyond. We have an idea of how they would have thought, because we have an idea of what their society was, or what their politics was, really. And this is important because it sort of humbles you and teaches you to appreciate still the fact that these peoples did fight, in many cases to the last. They did not give up in the first place, because great part of their culture was based exactly on this, on a metus hostilis, on desperation, if you want. And so you may want to appreciate the fact that it's not much about this or that people that we should sort of focus on, but rather the the moral dimension overall of this in the military conduct of the Celts and the innumerable tribes that made this people up, and being just even knowledgeable about classical literature enough to know that in many cases we don't have enough information about how even the Romans fought. And this is notorious to anyone who knows anything about the Roman military, that we know actually a dramatically few amount of information about their armies, their tactics, whatever. The fact that the Roman Empire was a big thing doesn't mean that in thickening the net, like for each period, we actually have a clear idea of how the Romans fought or whatever. They're all hypotheses at best, right? But again, remembering that moral forces are, from Clausewitz, the single most important dimension, and reading carefully the Latin sources that are particularly sensitive to that, just by culture of their culture, right, which is largely a warlike culture, is the best service you can render yourself if you really want to know about these populations. Now, another aspect about Celtic warfare gets down to the quality of their cavalry. I make this disclaimers basically every single Celtic warfare video that I make, because honestly, and I've been through the internet for decades. I'm a historian. I deal with these topics in particular, and I honestly never found sort of greater cognitive dissonance in a fanboyistic community, but for Celtic warfare. I mean, I know that there are some things like for the Germans in this way, but those revolve mostly around ethno-racialistic and nationalistic issues. The ones about the Romans are more sort of echoing with certain political aspects and or others that especially yes, there are the military myths about the Romans as well, but they are understood in fact still at an individual level, which is not the one as we've seen that makes sense even to study the Romans. And it's not to say that the quality there also was low. That's yet another myth, unfortunately. But truly, right, the sense is that there are some myths that have come up and that are truly believed by an impressive and unusually large amount of people in a sort of structural, systemic way. And when you dig, say, you scratch beneath the surface, you immediately understand that these are completely unfounded. I mean, it's not that there's been a study or a book or whatever that actually discussed this and proposed this, or it's a theory. It's basically just internet forums, cultures, or whatever, and that somehow has stuck because it's a bit like the rhetoric of the lost cause. I mean, the Germans had their space, right? The Romans had their space. Historically, they went on. We're largely sort of much more, say, aware of that legacy. The Celts, tragically, right, did not have enough of this, right? In the Anglosphere, there was in part an identitary sense, in another sort of remorse feeling regarding what happened to the Celtic world and the Celtic fringe and whatever, and so there is more sensitivity to this sort of mystical, warlike if you want, even romantic poetic mythology about the Celts that has developed the idea that, after all, the Romans were some sort of imposters that, in fact, fabricated an alternative history, and that the Celts were the third millennium civilization. This is an excess, of course, but it's the tone, right? It's just like trying to flip every single evidence without any of it. Trying to say that basically the Celts were sort of more military advanced than what the Romans would have made you believe, right? This is just like that guy Norman. This is how the Germans, at least, would make you believe, and all this kind of stuff. And this is, of course, a mental illness. It's basically borderline paranoia or something. It's just a superstition. I can't find, as a historian, any other explanation, honestly, for this behavior. But it's quite catchy, and it does have sometimes some racialistic undertone, whatever. But as a person who loves the Celts, I think that the best service I can render to them is to actually describe them for what they were on the basis of what we know, not what we would like them to have been. And there is actually nothing wrong in accepting the limits of this military. And since today we talk about cavalry, I must say that this is perhaps the top conspiracy, aside from the mechanistic, again, delusions. If the Celtic world had united, they would have defeated Rome. Yeah, that's the point. The Celtic world not only did not unite, but there is a very specific and equally macroscopic reason why they could not unite, and they would not unite, in fact, in this context. And I'm talking about the quality of their cavalry, right? Now, it's true that the Gauls had a true sort of boundless passion for horses. That's something we understand very clearly from their religion, from their from archaeology. Gaul had, as I was saying, been evolving socially towards some proto-feudalism of some sort. These were essentially stateless societies. There were some greater, say, tribes that had managed to establish some sort of magistracies through which they shared power in a sort of elevated way. The central southern Gaul had reached proto-urbanism to some extent. This did not kick in until Roman times, fully, whatever. But let's say that this was the reason, by the way, why the Romans had maintained so many ties with Central Gaul in the first place, and how it was true that this was a more open system than, say, the tougher and wilder north. But this proto-feudal system, where objectively, like, Gallic society was divided, as Caesar says, in this classes. You have the Druids, you have the nobility, basically, and then the rest of the people are sort of serfs by this point. Did not equate, because it's not a matter of form of society, but rather how it's calibrated, right? There are very healthy feudal societies. Look at, high medieval Europe. This one was instead unbalanced, right? It was getting sclerotic in a sense. You had this tough nobility that, as we will see now, could provide with very valuable individual warriors, but that, however, did not have this greater cohesional capacity, collective training, esprit de corps, because there wasn't even technically a corps in the picture. The majority of forces were, peasant levies. Yes, there were war bands here and there. Some were reaching even an important level of professionalism and even of, weight and etc. But the system was not to give birth to an actual army, right? To something that could have united Gaul, whatever, any of that. And when we look at Gallic cavalry, you can realize, of course, that the aristocracy would be the one mostly invested in this equine obsession that is really shared, if you look at the sedentary Europeans, by everyone, right? People think, for example, the Romans didn't have cavalry on their own, or they had so few and it was not good. Actually, the Romans had pretty damn good cavalry, right? If you look at the Punic Wars, etc., the Romans never lost in conditions of numerical parity. They had better cavalry commanders even than the Numidians had, and they always cared enormously about their mounted retinues, right? Just if they had some auxiliaries that could make the dirty work for them, that, let them go ahead, but that doesn't mean actually that they did not have a good cavalry. And I made lots of videos about archaic Roman warfare, where you really see how a feudal Rome had actually existed, and that notoriously, if one has an idea of the political institutional role of the equites, what was their exception regarding to the idea of the citizen soldiery, etc., payment, etc., that the Romans had, contrarily to the democratic and republican myth, an incredibly brutal, oligarchic, but also equestrian obsession with everything concerning their culture. And this was shared by pretty much everyone. This was true for the Celtiberians, it was true, even the Germans, in their own, if you read Tacitus, the Germans notoriously had a few cavalry in the early times, less practically than any other people in Europe, as far as I'm aware, except perhaps some Proto-Slavic population, the Finns or whatever. But they still were particularly connected with the sacrality of the horse, etc. And this is true also for the Greeks, etc. But here we're talking about sedentary systems that always had infantry as their decisive arms, right? The Iron Age sees still, if you look at the Celtic peasantry or the Roman citizenry, still, in spite of the dramatic social differences and inequalities, a pretty sound bulk of the idea of, that the average guy is a guy that can get armed and go fighting in in a functional way of some sort. And cavalry is not decisive in this world, right? Only in the nomadic steppe cavalry is decisive, and yet the nomadic steppes are military inferior to the sedentary world. So that makes you understand, also for some technical reasons, think about the posandals, right? Compared to horseshoeing in the Middle Ages, how actually weak cavalry was. But this, in physical terms, and compared again to the later developments, but it doesn't mean that cavalry was, in this sense, not ideologically or symbolically important. And the Celts, again, had a true, especially the Gauls, had this enormous passion for horses, and I can't stress that enough. As we've seen, who had a horse did not make it a matter of principle to fight on it. As we said, the idea is that if you run away, you're sort of a coward, right? The younger elements, for example, of these societies usually skirmished with javelins, bows, slings, etc., in front of the ranks of the men, right? The youth was something else, a bit like the velitas in the Roman army compared to the actual heavy infantry, right? So you didn't want to be somebody running. You had to stand your ground and cut to pieces the person in front of you. Then, aside from romantic aspects, of course, cavalry was developed, was also abundant numerically in Gaul, right? Most of the aforementioned mythology regarding the Gauls having, or the Celts in general, a particularly strong cavalry derives from the fact that very often they had numbers, right? More numbers than the Roman ones, that still, however, managed to take over these populations. And so in warfare, it's not, sometimes the numbers are good, right? They can balance quality, that there are not wild differences in that sense. So paradoxically, as always, by the way, because that's where it gets from these peoples, they have been documented truly just by the Romans and the Greeks. So any kind of positive that you may want to point out is still something coming from the same guys that some paranoid person thinks we're sort of saying only negative things about these people. So you have to decide of the two, one. Like in every infantry-dominated warfare, who wanted, had to, or could risk the horse was essentially grouped on the wings of the host, perhaps without even knowing who. I mean, the guy who was just next to him, right and left, right. This had to do with, of course, the way Celtic armies were normally arrayed, right. The Gauls, admittedly, were a bit more advanced, right, in terms of numbers. Again, they could gather more troops. They had sort of more supplies, capacity, etc. But also in practice, we really, look at some simple contingencies that we shouldn't exchange as peculiarities of their warfare, connected to specific reasons that in fact we find in other cases of tribal clientery type of warfare. These forces had a scarce collective training. They had a minimal knowledge and trust among the leaders, by the way. And so remember that here we're talking about hundreds distinguished units, perhaps counting only 10, 20 men each. And this is true even for infantry. You can imagine for cavalry. And especially this was the point, were united, were brought together only for the occasion. And so the say what was more coherent to say is that aside from the differences that existed, as we've seen, on the level of development, political organization, etc., those who had more time for deploying, who had the more cohesive leaders, had more solid men, that is, better rested, fed, a loyal man, tended to have a greater cohesion also in the field with sort of close order. The others sometimes in very messy ways, without being able, especially in such a dynamic warfare like the one of cavalry, maintaining a cohesion from a charge to another. That is a very important indicator, right? You do not have normally at this point in history cavalry units that are able to perform more than 2-3 charges in significant numbers on the battlefield. Right? Surely the Gauls had some of this, but we do not really see them. So statistically, this fits perfectly with this distribution, right? And always consider again that the sources are not even particularly interested in this, meaning that more or less, again, Europeans fought, after all in the same way, except some were more professional, better trained, and better equipped. Others were, again, just loser in that regard, and so they could put up a hell of a struggle, like it happened countless times during the Gallic Wars. But at the end of the day, the bigger picture tells us that these people did not have as a qualitative military like the one that was taking them over. So the Gauls had lots of cavalry. This was, as we said before, an advantage. This did scare the Romans. But as we've seen, without training, its quality was generally scarce. Think about even the wilder Germans, again, that provided by Caesar with the Roman mounts that are able to check Gallic cavalry that was much more burst, say, traditionally than the Germanic one in this arms function. So that's also the thin line that differentiates these Central European populations in the first place. This is pretty much it, right? The Helvetians, the Belgians were more warlike, more combative, right? They had a greater national cohesion, hence a higher training, and a superior one to the Gallic average, right? Even if they had, especially in the case of the Belgians, less cavalry. The more famous cavalry is the one of the Remi, right? Documented in Caesar's times. There were other peoples, in fact, towards the southeast there, like the Treveri, that were technically not Belgians. They were also about this more equestrian traditions. But again, we lack the absolute factorial measurement of the tactical, operational deployability of these troops, right? So we haven't seen them. We just don't hear wonders about them. We just have an idea that we're more or less how we have described them, right? An interesting aspect, as we were saying before, about Belgian warfare is that war chariots did survive among them in combat, but even about that, they generally speaking were these chariots were checked by the stronger infantry, right? They just cooperated as political cohesion. This is very important to stress, right? Many people say, but if the cavalry is stronger, let's say in a military context, doesn't mean that infantry is weaker. Hell no, right? There are some military cultures in history that we say, well, that we don't consider, for example, the infantry of just because they obviously could fight with cavalry and infantry, and other peoples that had just infantry that were obliged to fight like that and maybe pulled off a decent victory, become the infantry heroes of the situation, even though their infantry was not that strong on a systemic or structural basis. This happens all the freaking time. In any case, Belgian tactics did not differ from the one of the other Gauls, right? The Belgians are a bit more heroic in mindset, even though if we speak of the immediate pre-Roman era, right, the heroic ethos in the wider Celtic world survived only in Britain, and by the way, heroic combat in the Homeric acception in reality it never existed, right? As it would happen eventually also in the Middle Ages, and still among the Celts, by the way, that survived. The heroes were always accompanied by a retinue, and the duels were the exception, not the rule. Also consider that the Celts did not really have much of an influence, strictly speaking, from the Greek-Roman military cultures, right? The influence of these peoples extended a few tens of miles beyond Massalia, and they did not mark the warlike traditions and habits of the Celts. And simply because the Celts were another system. And in many ways, of course, the Romans and the Greeks were also peculiar, and we shouldn't think that there was too much of a mystery why also military quality differed so much. In general, after all, quite certain boundaries were established also, for example, in southern Gaul with the Roman presence since the 2nd century BC, and why the Celts had remained north without essentially doing anything or having a need to do anything, really. I think this intro is always very important to stress in practice what we're talking about. If we have to look at the image of a northern Gallic cavalryman, we of course can draw information from archaeology, descriptions, general, at some point, theories. There are some better, some worse, depending on how we want to see the thing, and we'll try to explain this as well, right? So the only glimpse on Northern Gallic cavalry gets to us from Caesar, and it's a superficial one. Caesar doesn't have a need to specify, I don't know, whether Northern Gallic cavalry was better than the Central Gallic one, because they were pretty much the same, and the Romans did not have this rigid modernistic categories, right? This is a pre-Linnean world, and Caesar cared about how this battle had been fought, with which spirits, with which capacities, and what this really meant in a moral sense. We will talk about Southern Gallic cavalry as well, because we have, of course, from the previous centuries, an interesting Celto-Roman military history where that was about this Southern group, and conventionally defined, that is depicted, described, etc. in different ways, and we can draw here a stereotypical sketch of what instead a Northern Gallic one would have looked like, even though they could look like exactly the same depending on the guys. So first of all, let's talk about who these guys were. Also for the Belgians, in spite of the lesser stratification of their society, of course, cavalry was an expression of the aristocracy, right? An average horseman, in this sense, was a lesser nobleman of some sort. There were lots of just followers in this regard that had much lighter equipment. At some point, no armor at all, just a shield, a spear, and a couple of javelins, like some secondary weapon, like every warrior, also on foot. And again, it doesn't make too much sense to try to distinguish here infantry from cavalry in terms of individual equipment. The typical helmet would have been made of bronze, could be made of iron as well. Consider that these northern areas are sort of more backwards, and they have not necessarily wanted or could even afford a greater spread of iron manufacturing for equipping a larger amount of troops, like it was the case among the Romans, for example. They still, of course, use bronze as well, or the central Gauls. So having a bronze helmet was a hell of a social distinction, even though, of course, these peoples were not tremendously poor. They were fairly, okay, the Belgians a bit less than the central Gauls, but still they were an advanced society. And they had, for the times and places, a decent material wealth. There were various forms of these bronze helmets, but of course the main point is about deflecting the blows. There are not just the ones from projectiles, but also and especially from the long swords that the same warriors brandished, as we will see now, that could just deliver tremendous blow from top to bottom, especially when the warriors were dismounted and this cavalryman would arrive to hit them. As it's famously witnessed by the massive neck guards that the Gallic helmets displayed had been developing, exactly because of the development of cavalry, right? Especially again in the central part of Gaul. Which is also, in fact, where the Romans take the design from. The neck guards existed a bit in all helmets back in antiquity, but these were really massive. Think about the Gallic, the imperial types. I made a video about that a long time ago, but we'll come back on it. I made also a video about the Celtic metallurgic legacy in Romano-Germanic warfare that talks about this a bit as well. The shield would have, say, typically a bronze boss or iron one, and most horsemen's shields were round. It's fair to say that. Also considering that here we're not looking at the heaviest type of cavalry. I think I made a video about the at least the heavy Celtic warrior, probably the ones with chainmail and reinforcement and so on. So those were like the ultra heavy cavalry of probably the retinues, the bodyguards of the major leaders. But here in general, even again, a lesser nobleman was more lightly equipped. Not always, right? We'll see now. Of course, chainmail was there, but it cost a freaking lot. And Celtic society was not just, yes, the Celts were famous for those designs and that metallurgic skills and creation, etc. But the affordability was something else. right? In interest of of person, of individual availability. In any case, the heavier you go equipped, say the smaller the shield you need, in theory, especially on horseback, right? This may not be specifically true that the Gauls also had pretty large shields, oval or chopped oval in shape, for example. So this would confer a greater protection and possibility of also almost entering right in the concave shape, which suggests also an individualistic fencing. It's not different from, say, the Roman scutum concept. This was a design that developed basically in parallel both in the Celtic world and the Italian peninsula, and that highlights again the quite individualistic basis from which eventually all this military evolved from. They're really warrior societies, also the Roman one, in spite of the legionary discipline. Yes, in a way, I would argue that a medium type of cavalry, which is a concept that doesn't make too sense, but let's say would have paradoxically larger shields. Lighter cavalry would have smaller shields because of sake of agility. The heavier elite cavalry would have tendentially smaller shields because they had the chainmail, so they didn't need much of a larger one, right? So depending on what you had to protect yourself, legs, etc. Legs were unarmored, normally at least up to the thighs. The longest chainmail arrived to cover that. Of course, we could see much more, say, atypical armor used by Celtic warriors at some point. If we had been on one of these battlefields, we would have been amazed, likely, by the degree of heterogeneity, of ingenuity, of solutions, of styles, and so on. But we understand also that this was pretty much the dominant design because it was simply the most effective one. And again, even too heavy cavalry is not really to be found because A, it cost a freaking lot. Secondly, because of this reason, they were just an elite. They were employed in different ways. So it would be sort of standard. It's fair to say that a Northern Gallic cavalryman was on average poorer, even as a lesser nobleman, than his counterpart in Central Gaul, right? This doesn't mean, again, that he was worse, nor individually nor collectively. And so you may want to appreciate in this sense that the esprit de corps, as far as these units reached in the best scenario, was enough also to sort of avoid the even a higher individual protection. This is like in some Hellenistic cavalries, even though those are really a different thing. They really stem, as the exception in Europe, from a really feudal society like the Macedonian one was, the exception in Senatory world. They could have very long lances, say, and counting on the close order, collective training to just spare the men from even a higher, say, a heavier armor, because the important thing was mostly the charge, right? If they succeeded, they could do without. It's like in the steppe where there is so much archery, but of course the way to come out of there alive is having more archery, not being heavier, say more armored in that sense. So this obviously is comparing apples to oranges, but just conceptually can help to make you understand this difference. But speaking of the shield, we know that virtually all of them were solidly constructed of wood. They were often faced with leather and brightly painted. We will talk better about this now, also as far as the various designs on the patterns on the clothing and so on. Surely it would have been a very colorful sight. We will make a video about the Celtic decorative patterns as well, which are religiously very interesting. Some are geometrical, some are floral, some are sort of differently patterned. We have even thunders. They look very similar to the Roman ones. We have torques, etc. The Romans again had very similar symbols because they always had them. Like the idea is that the Romans copied everything from everybody, but technically they always had them themselves. And why not the other way around, by the way? But it's always in parallel, and surely by exposure to one another. But this just reconfirms the incredible similarity between Gallic and Italic cultures, which is something that, again, against many, don't like to hear for some reason because of the racialistic implications. Of course, recognizing a boundary that was actually quite scarce, and as just the Gallic declension actually tells, it's identical to the second Latin one, by the way. And of course, there were lots of military terms, both in Gallic and in Latin, that stemmed from the same Indo-European matrix, and they were developed independently. Or even if, again, these peoples had always bordered one another, they had been there from a very long time in the first place. But again, they were cousins. Unfortunately, again, a racialistic obsession in the 19th century among the fourth estate or lesser people has come to, before people were educated, at least the elite who ruled them, right? Then after that, you have to make them believe that they are relevant just because they are people, and dividing themselves in macroscopic categories that are very often invented. So the idea is, we like the Celts because, I don't know, we want to be the northern guys, right? So, the Romans, what are those black, that's not quite the case. So going on, as we were saying, the richest Gallic horsemen would wear body armor of some importance. We know very few about the non-metal stuff, the organic one that naturally perished over time. It's fair to say that the universal armor used, the metal armor used at this point, which is essentially the 1st century BC, was iron mail, right? You would have shoulder reinforcements, as they also were appearing essentially in parallel in the Roman army, also to cope against enemies like this. They had basically the same function of the neck guard, except, of course, the more armor you have, the better you can defend yourself from everything. There is a lot of determinism saying, that this design was invented specifically because of that weapon. Hey, whatever that is, a sword, an arrow, whatever that, it's an extra thing. And what simply is going to impact overall is how you manage troops overall that are equipped like this. Tactically on the field because of their weight, but also logistically because you have to supply them. It's all more calories, and you have to and armor is good largely for basically any type of weapon that is also designed to counter it, and vice versa, right? So you get that. The idea is that, again, mailed horsemen could form single elite units, right? But it was more likely, given their proportional paucity, for them to have been employed as officers for ordinary cavalry units, right? So if you had a really powerful leader, of course he would have been defended in battle by these men who had, by the way, a fanatic sense of loyalty. We know that from many anecdotes. This is the typical warband mentality. These guys that have a lot to earn from distinguishing themselves. They truly believe in an afterlife where, of course, their sacrifice is going to be recognized, but also socially they can't behave less than their leader, otherwise they're lost, and their cause is lost. All right. And some of these guys were, however, so experienced that they would have been used as the medieval Rottmeister, like the essentially the leader of a cavalry formation would ride in front of the ranks, shouting at this or that guy to maintain formation, which, especially in a Celtic context, was really a challenge, also because these guys had, again, not just as scarce collective training, but as such they were trying to just compete with one another to say, I'm first, because screw, discipline and collective safety. I just want to arrive first at the enemy line so that somebody can compose a song about me and people can know that I'm cool and I can fit in the right clientele's radar if you had not been killed in the same action. But it was also, this behavior was also functional to the actual boosting of collective training at the end of the day. Again, the Celts were, especially the Gauls, were going towards a direction of a sort of more, developed military, but very gradually, right? But again, there was a lot of cavalry, and sometimes these individual elite horsemen were better used to confer, like through their wisdom, their experience, their expertise, that minimal level of collective training, just being charismatic figures, infusing a sense of trust, of confidence in the man, and of course having their own clientele themselves. I mean, especially the higher in society they really were, so they could switch roles in many ways. One practice you could have still seen among the heavier cavalrymen, which is something you can easily see, for example, in the Bayeux tapestry, still in the 11th century, when there were stirrups, horseshoeing, etc., is the fact that in ancient times Celts would throw javelins at their enemies to soften up their ranks before charging in, right? Of course, there were lighter cavalrymen that we will discuss at some other point that were designed specifically for this task, but also the heaviest, that's why I cited the Normans in that case, would have to do the same. Also because if they were arrayed in a substantial unit and they were equipped with these javelins, and again, they were not a feudal society to the point that they would have learned, to charge straight like the Normans would do later with all the the political and social background and the technologies that had been developed stemming from that, which did not exist at this point. They would have needed to soften up before the enemy ranks, trying to, again, take out the guys of the front ranks. This was easier to do when you had pinned down an infantry unit, but of course you would have had, normally within the same Gallic world, other horsemen in front of you, and so they would have been, as I was saying before, in terms of individual capacity, very good at sort of throwing these javelins in specific targets at close range. Javelins were also anti-armor weapons, right? They would continue to be so effectively for a very long time. Even in the age of firearms, a javelin against armor was one of the best weapons you could use, especially in siege warfare, right? The Gauls had, and this is perhaps an underappreciated aspect of the story, a lot of siege warfare, right? We mostly see them, of course, in Caesar fighting against Roman fortifications. And their ones were, of course, less sophisticated, but as you know, their oppida were gradually, fortified. They were importantly articulated, and so this sort of knightly mentality, especially among the elite, of arriving in front of an enemy fortification, taunting the enemy, challenging him into even individual combat or something like that, but otherwise entering the spaces and storming the walls, having that sort of heavy commando style, men-at-arm assault capacity on the enemy was something many of these guys were habituated to as well, aside from the usual raids, massacres of any kind. And they would act, of course, with lighter types of troops, right? There would be lighter horsemen that, again, were not arrayed, lined up in a close order, and that would assist the heavies also because of these exploit feats of arms that did include, like in medieval times, again, one guy saying screw up, safety or discipline. I will just run in front of the enemy lines and make this bravado and emerge as the coolest guy ever, right? Or my 10, 20 men will be the first one to launch ourselves, because against what had been decided by the council before this battle, because first, there's not really much of a central power that can punish me, but even if I succeed, right, I will be glorified and I will gain more power, more youth will like to follow me, I will be more powerful, and I will make a career like this. And this is how they were refining themselves, right? Also in a strictly military sense, also collectively, right, to make it work. After the shower of javelins, of course, these knights would pass to the charge using the long sword or javelin or light spear retained to thrust as well, right? Spears were used in every single possible way, thrusting, throwing, overarm, underarm. Really, this happened throughout all of history in a non-standard way, just a prevalent one. And of course, ancient cavalries charged, and they charged pretty hard in spite of the later developments. Vision that we could have this, again, weaker ancient cavalry, but they did really charge, and they could be really an impressive force, especially against less trained and infantry formations that maybe among the Belgians in northern Gaul would have been actually tougher to break in, and that's why they had also less cavalry there. But think this in central Gaul, where most farmers, peasants are just de facto serfs, right? They can be levied, but they're not going to withstand much of a charge. They would do in some cases, but again, if you look at the later period, the heroic phase of the Celtic war bands is sort of over, right? These guys had started to settle down, but also to impoverish themselves under the local aristocracies that, on the contrary, are becoming that more powerful and mounted, right? But if you look at northern Gaul, again, cavalry is a slightly lesser option, quantitatively and proportionally, right? As for just a general, typical look, these guys in northern Gaul would have had, this is for the sake of wargamism, blonde, brown, or red hair. Of course, they would have had, say, even darker hair, etc., but more or less, right? They were stereotypically represented like this. They often plaited the hair at the front, and they shaved their chins, yet delighting themselves with long mustaches that are sort of, in fact, very stereotypical for the Gauls. And they corresponded, as we will see now, to specific identities as well, which is a topic we can touch from the cloaks, right? When you look at the patterns, you could see tartan, striped, bordered, right? And the colors, the favorite ones apparently being scarlet, blue, black. The tunics could be sometimes bright yellow. We have other favorite colors for tunics and trousers, such as purple, scarlet, brown, and the patterns are still the same. Now, what about the stripes, checkers, and tartans? Meaning, right? Is there a... of course, they were colored different combinations. You know that the Celts had this sort of tartan pattern that we see also among other Indo-European peoples. Some Tocharian mummies were clothed with something looking very oddly similar to the Proto-Celts back in the day, for which, since the Tocharians, as you know, are part of the Western branch, just like the Celts, the Germans, the Italics, etc., not the Iranians, right? Not the Eastern branch of Indo-Europeans, it was thought that something, of course, just Hellenic geometric painting. This designs, these patterns were meant to represent some universal order in the person, and the colors too were, of course, connected with some sort of proto-heraldic meaning. And this is it, right? Some scholars say that the choice of colors or pattern was a matter of individual taste rather than of tribal significance. However, I think instead that some clans, families, or followers of a particular leader would be partly uniformed in this way. The concept of uniform, of course, does not have to be understood in a modern sense in this case, but having studied this a lot for the Middle Ages as well, in other similar societies, I've never seen a convincing point of why before heraldry there is basically just in uniforms that are properly a modern thing, right? The say colors, symbols, etc. could have not, of medieval ancient times, could have not have the same actual meaning. On the contrary, from my studies of history of religions, I'm prone to think that they had even a stronger meaning in that regard, and that heraldry, in a way, in the modern age, was the exasperation of a lost knowledge that at the time, in terms of colors, designs, symbols, was much more strongly known, right? I made a video, by the way, it was one of the earliest about properly Celtic, say, I said totemic, I think, in the title, animals. It's not technically a totemic thing, at least not fully, anthropologically speaking, but there is some explanation there. These guys, say the symbolism, this animal symbolism. I also made a series about this back in the day, but we will talk about it perhaps better on another occasion. Because I have to either to re-upload that or to, find it somewhere. We will see how it goes. But to make a long story short, I'm prone to believe that, of course, political fragmentation did not particularly favor uniformity, nor I believe that these guys had, just like the Romans, the resources, given how costly the military really was by itself, to spend resources for uniforming with single colors, single patterns, and so on. But since some colors and patterns, at least were there, and they would have had just a modest symbolical capacity, by the way. You have to recognize who these guys are, especially on horseback. Where are these guys jumping around? You must recognize them at the first sight, because it could be literally the difference between life and death in particular circumstances. Well, I think the color would help a lot, and especially among cavalry and the horsemen, and so these guys that were just more affluent, as we've seen by themselves, you would have more frequently seen such patterns, such colors. First of all, much better sort of represented, despite of the we do not know exactly what it looked like if the overall picture was more somber and say these more vivacious colors were so there, because they cost much, by the way, the dyes and all. But they would have surely made more, they would have served more that identification purpose among this elite than it would be, among other troops, right? It's it makes sense, right? This may have extended in part to the same retinues, and I wouldn't see anything strange about that. So I fear there's not much more. I'm sure I can dig sort of the single most specialized and updated archaeological acquisitions to say whether we have an idea about what this this northern Gauls would have looked like, as opposed to say the southern ones with similar things. But overall, I think that what we said here makes enough sense. We will keep talking about Celtic warfare. There is really a lot to dig here in, and for today, however, I stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.